All right, guys, we're finally here. So we've been talking about GraphQL for a while now, and I'm so excited because today we're going to finally leave the theoretical aspect and actually build a GraphQL system. All right, coding videos are usually very long, and so what I did for this particular video was to break it down into two-part series. All right, we're going to take the first part today and probably do the next part. I actually recorded all of the videos, right? But I'm just going to break it down so that can help your psyche to complete the video. So in today's video, we're actually going to be building a GraphQL system, basically an API, a music API, right? More like your Spotify or whatever music player it is you use. And we're going to have three major features. You're going to be able to create songs. You're going to be able to create artists, link an artist with a song. You're also going to be able to create playlists, right? You're going to be able to add a song to multiple songs to a particular playlist, and we're going to be doing all of this using GraphQL. That sounds fun to me. Let's get right into it. So the first thing we're going to be doing is to set up the project. It's going to be called Music API, and I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. You could use Visual Studio as well, whichever one suits you best. And I'm going to be using a tool called .NET EF to create a web API template. Again, you could use Visual Studio, whichever one suits you best. I'm going to be creating a web API template, and thereafter I'm going to be stripping out all of the components of web APIs that I do not need. All right, things like the controllers, weather forecast thingy, we're going to be stripping all of those out and just basically doing a cleanup. All right, so the next thing is to get the packages that are needed. I already have a list of packages on screen, so you can just download those packages according to their versions. Basically, because if you really want to follow along, you might want to use those versions, especially for hot chocolate. Some of the updated version do not have some of the components that we're going to be using, so try to follow along. Also still in the process of stripping out things that are not needed. I'm going to be removing a couple of boilerplate code from my program.cs and just leaving it down to the bare bone. Next, we're going to be creating some folders that are necessary for us to build. Data folder, going to be creating GraphQL folder. A data folder is going to contain our DB context, while our model folder contains all of our models that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using code first pattern. So you're going to be seeing some migration happen. Basically going to be playing around three models. We'll have the artist model, song model, and the playlist model. On creating our models, we're going to be creating our DB context. Our DB context is going to obviously be the link from our code to our database, because we're actually going to be using a real database. I'm going to be using SQL Server. You can plug into any database of your choice, right? And I changed the model from music to song. That just kind of made sense to me. Let me know in the comment section below if you do not understand this concept. These are basic .NET Core concepts, entity framework concepts as well, right? So we're going to be doing .NET build to ascertain that our code builds correctly, which obviously it does not, because I have a little bit of issues with namespacing. I eventually had to switch to Visual Studio Code because of this, but yeah. As I said, we're going to be using a real database, so we're going to be filling the connection string. I'm going to be using a local database in MySQL server. If you're going to be doing the same, you can just copy the connection string and use as is. Then we go ahead to set up our DB context in our program.cs. I'm going to be using a concept called pooled DB context. It basically just help to solve the issues around concurrent queries. If you do not use a pool DB context, you might run into issues with concurrency, especially as pertain to GraphQL. So okay, so using same .NET EF tool, you could also do a migration from here using .NET EF migration. That's what I did. Run a migration to generate our script, and afterwards we would run our .NET EF database updates to translate all of those model changes into the database. I usually have to check my migration files, just so to confirm that entity framework core did what I needed it to do, of which in this case it wasn't it, right? So you can notice that I have a playlist ID in a song, but playlist and song ought to have many-to-many relationship, right? So on checking, because I checked my file, I could pick that up. So I think it's a good habit to always check what EF core generates for you, especially when you do not determine or when you do not depict the relationship by using your Fluent APIs, right? So I had to do this, add this to my song model, just so to tell Entity Framework Core that the relationship between songs and playlists is a many-to-many relationship. And for sure, Entity Framework Core was smart enough to then create another model which is basically the relationship model that was going to be housing the song ID, the playlist ID, obviously just to maintain the many-to-many relationship. Right, so you see entity framework called creating a table on its own called playlist song, which basically holds the two ID. How beautiful. Afterwards, we'll run our database updates to translate to the database, and we have our tables. Right, so there you have it. You can see your playlist and you can see the playlist song. That was the database, that was the table entity framework call generated on itself. So next thing we're going to do is to create a mutation file. Our mutation file is obviously going to be the resolver. The mutation file is what tells GraphQL how to undo mutations. And if you do not understand what mutations are, I would advise that you check the previous episodes so you could get up to speed on it. And as commented here, we're going to be doing three things in our mutation: creating an artist, creating a song, and creating a playlist. So we're going to create a DTO for creating an artist. These DTOs are very important because they are going to form the basis of your schema, and your schema is what the front-end developer or whoever it is that is reading your GraphQL documentation is going to see. So that attribute called scoped service is actually from Hot Chocolate. Hot Chocolate helps you handle the DI dependency injection side of things here, so you don't have to do the constructor type of injecting dependencies. You just add that particular attribute, and there is another attribute that we would have to add to decorate the method itself, just so that the scope service works. But we're going to do, you're going to see that as we continue. Alright, so it's just the normal process of inserting an entity into a database: create the objects, add the objects, save the changes, and return a response. Nothing different. So in our program.cs file, we're going to add some components that is needed to be added to the DI as well from hot chocolate package. Well, first off, it's called add mutation type. Helps us register all of our mutation, and also add GraphQL server. That helps us actually set up a GraphQL server. All of this comes from hot chocolate. Very fantastic framework for GraphQL in .NET. And we also have map GraphQL, and we also have use GraphQL Voyager. GraphQL Voyager is basically more like a model documentation for GraphQL. It just helps you see your model and your relationship more like in a graphical representation. Very interesting stuff, of which I believe I would show that later. Right, so one thing I noticed after creating my mutation was that for one reason or the other, GraphQL or chocolate, doesn't pick up your mutation without a query. Alright, so I'm creating this mutation and I'm running this project. I couldn't see it translate. I eventually had to move to Visual Studio because I had too many issues with Visual Studio Code not doing autocomplete, so I couldn't bear it any longer. I had to move so I can get stuff done faster. Alright, so I couldn't get GraphQL to see my mutation until I eventually added a query. I'm not sure why that is, but the solution to this was creating a query. So on adding a query, everything started working as it should. So that's what we're going to do. This didn't work, obviously, because, as I said, probably because I didn't have a query. Mutations alone, for one reason or the other, does not show up. Right, so go ahead to add a query. We'll add a query, basically a query to get all of the artists, and that was sufficient enough to get our schema to show up and our GraphQL application to start listening for requests as it should. Query file is basically the same thing as your mutation, other than the fact that your query file is basically a resolver that tells GraphQL how to and in our case hot chocolate which is a package for GraphQL, how to actually resolve a particular query. So in this case, we're trying to write a query resolver for get artists. So this tells GraphQL or chocolate how to get artists, basically. Use DB context is an attribute from hot chocolate. It basically just helps in resolving the used pool DB context that we added on our program.cs. If we had used the normal DB context, we wouldn't need this use DB context, but because we are using pooled DB context factory, we need to tell hot chocolate how to actually resolve that factory and get an original DB context. Hence the reason why we're using that particular attribute. The next thing, we also needed to add a query type, register a query type to DI container. And here you have it. You can see autocomplete working automatically, and you can see artist async, of which I eventually found out that whatever name you put on your method, especially for your query, it has a way of picking out your method names and using it as more like as your query parameter, right? So I eventually had to remove the async from the method, and you could also see our schema adding up, right, which wasn't the case previously when we had just mutation. So if you do not know what a schema is, I'd advise that you check out previous lessons. So you see, we can immediately start to query for artists, and that works. So as I said, needed to remove the async because obviously GraphQL was picking that async and adding it to the name of my documentation or my schema. So on removing this async, that changed, and that looks much better. Right, so we'll do a refresh on our schema, and our schema changes immediately. So you can see the query pane changing from artist async to artist. So that makes much sense. So we'll just manually populate our artist in database just for test purpose, and we'll do a get on that. And eventually we will be using our mutation to actually do that population. So can get the ID field, get the name, and get the date joined. That works. So now we can test our mutation as well. To begin any mutation, you start with the keyword mutation. Treated that in past lessons. So we have add mutation, and add mutation takes in an input, add mutation input, which that's a proper JSON. That's more like a JSON as well, where you get to add the name of the artist, and every other thing will be added. Basically just exposing your DTO, right? And then you can specify what you want to see as per the result of the new artist that was added. So you can test out a mutation, and there was a problem obviously with our music DB context. Now this is happening because we did not use the decorator on the method. There is no use DB context decorator on the method. That's what I was explaining. So that's why we need to add this. This tells Hot Chocolate how to do the resolution, and we can get this to work. All right, so that works. So we can also just get back to do a query on all of our artists and see if we get our newly added artists. which we did. All right, so just as I've said, it's a two-part series. We're going to be wrapping up this particular part here, just so it doesn't get too long. But I'm going to be uploading the next part very soon because I'd already done the uploading. I'm just going to do some editing. If you've not subscribed, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you can get up to date on the other parts that are going to coming up and all that technical contents if that's your thing. And also do well to like and give a good comment in comment section if you love what's going on here. I'll see you guys on the next one real quick. A nice one. Cheers.